Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Barbara Jacobson from Basic Income UK, and I'm really pleased to be hosting this conversation with Christopher Balfour, who's been a longtime supporter certainly during our adventures in Europe, and yeah, and always been a really key person in my mind in the history of all of this. And then we have Peter Sloman, who is a professor at Cambridge and has written several books, but most specifically, The Transfer State, which talks about the history of minimum income schemes. And yeah, thank you, Christopher. It's a great book. In the UK, it's really the only thing of its kind, so I really recommend. And just for Christopher's sake, we've got Learning from Difference, which is Christopher's autobiography and is what inspired this call. So first, Peter's going to give a short potted history of this Conservative Party's involvement with basic income or basic income-like schemes. And then he'll go on into talk to Christopher about his extremely rich life as a councilor and as an employment as a careers officer and all kinds of things. So, and politics, which I think is really what we're about right now. So take it away, Peter.
Thank you very much, Barb, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. It's interesting, isn't it, that basic income today is often seen in the media as a radical or sometimes left-wing idea. But if you go back to the middle decades of the 20th century, most of the interest in basic income type schemes could be found among either liberals or conservatives. I guess in that era of great optimism about the growth of the welfare state, the Labour Party was very strongly influenced by its links with the trade unions and the trade union ideal of a family wage achieved through collective bargaining. And at the same time, of course, Labour was strongly committed to the expansion of collective welfare services, such as the National Health Service, but also state education, council housing, food subsidies, and so on. So if you look at some of the earliest basic income debates in Britain in the 1930s and 1940s, it's striking that much of the interest in rationalising the social security system and thinking about how the tax and benefit systems fitted together came from liberals and conservatives who were keen to establish a kind of national minimum income floor, influenced not only by liberals such as Stephen Rowntree and William Beveridge, but also by people like Winston Churchill, who was very strongly committed to a national minimum in his own thought. And liberals and conservatives were keen to promote personal choice and independence within the tax and social security systems. As far as I can tell, the real pioneer in this respect was a woman called Juliet Rhys-Williams, a Liberal Party activist in the 1940s, who later defected to the Conservatives in the run-up to the 1950 election, who had been an activist and really a kind of anti-poverty and anti-malnutrition campaigner in South Wales in the Depression years, and had been struck by the difficulties which unemployed men faced in taking casual or temporary work, because they couldn't take small amounts of work without losing their benefit entitlements. And Rhys-Williams was struck when the Beveridge report came out by the similarities between the support which the state provided to those in work through income tax allowances and those out of work through social security payments, and began to argue quite vigorously and persistently for rationalising these systems. And if you look at the Conservative Party papers from the 1940s, you will see that the party took a close interest in these schemes. In the end, it didn't take them up, partly because Winston Churchill was very keen to avoid committing the party to very detailed tax proposals in the run-up to the 1950 and 1951 elections. He believed that it was right to give the Chancellor of the Exchequer as free a hand as possible when the party got back into government. But nevertheless, people like Howell Macmillan, David Eccles, Roy Harrod, who later became Macmillan's economics advisor, and Reginald Maudling, later Chancellor, studied Rhys Williams's ideas and took a close interest in them. Again, in the 1960s, when Milton Friedman's proposals for a negative income tax were very fashionable in the United States, and there was lots of debate around poverty relief on both sides of the Atlantic, the Conservatives under Edward Heath looked at negative income tax and basic income schemes. And Brandon Rhys Williams, who was Juliet Rhys Williams's son and Tory MP for South Kensington from 1968, was very energetic in arguing that really a basic income was the most efficient way of adapting the UK personal tax and social security systems to meet that objective of providing a minimum income to everyone. And that argument seemed to have gained an audience in the Heath years, when Arthur Cofield, who was a former Inland Revenue official, then a special advisor to Anthony Barber, the Chancellor, and later, of course, became a European Commissioner and the architect of the European single market, he designed a tax credit scheme that was based on Rhys Williams's ideas, and that basically involved giving almost all the population, about 90% of the population, a kind of weekly tax credit in place of their personal tax allowance. So that if they earned more than that, or rather if they had a tax liability above that, then it would act as a tax allowance. If they had a lower tax liability, they would receive the balance of their tax credit in cash as a payment from the Department of Health and Social Security. And I think that green paper on a tax credit system, which the Heath government published in 1972, is the closest that any British government has come to implementing a basic income. It wasn't quite there. It excluded about 10% of the population, particularly those who were out of work and outside the social insurance system, which William Beveridge had set up 30 years previously. But nevertheless, it was almost there. And there was an argument for saying that once that had been set up, it might have led to a basic income eventually, simply because it would have been easier to make the payment to everybody instead of excluding very small categories of the population. But the tax credit scheme fell when the Heath government lost the February 1974 general election, and the incoming Labour government, which had many social spending commitments of its own, was looking for ways to save money. And one of the easiest ways of saving money was scrapping a tax credit scheme which hadn't yet been introduced. And so this idea went off the agenda for several years. But it came back again, as Christopher can attest, in the early 1980s, in the context of mass unemployment, 3 million unemployed, in the wake of the early 1980s recession and the Thatcher government's monetarist policies and its attempts to squeeze inflation out of the economy by raising interest rates and keeping sterling high. And many people across the political spectrum worried that mass unemployment might have come for good, or rather for bad, and perhaps even forever, and were looking for ways to help people who are out of work to adjust to the new economic landscape. And it was in 1984, partly inspired by Brandon Rhys Williams's work and largely led by his research assistant Hermione Parker, that the Basic Income Research Group was set up in Britain, an organisation that's now the Citizens Basic Income Trust, and has been run for most of the last 20 years by Malcolm Torrey, though I believe he's recently stepped down. And so it's really in the 1980s that you see basic income go mainstream as a kind of solution to the problems of deindustrialization and economic change in post-war Britain. that are afflicting so many people in that period. And Rhys Williams and Parker were among the most influential figures in that movement. If you look at Hansard for the 1980s, particularly a debate in 1985, you will see that basic income was endorsed by people like Francis Pym, the former Foreign Secretary, infamously sacked by Mrs. Thatcher after he dared to say that it might not be a good idea if she won a landslide in the 1983 election. David Howell, in his book Blind Victory from 1986, and also Edward Lee, still I think MP for Gainsborough, who endorsed a basic income scheme in a 1985 House of Commons debate. And it's striking that actually in a debate last year on coping with coronavirus, Edward Lee returned to that theme and said, even more than 30 years on, he still thought a basic income would have been quite a useful tool for dealing with this pandemic, as indeed it would have been. But of course, as you know, in the intervening 30 or 35 years, the Conservative Party's attitude towards social benefits has really hardened, partly under Mrs. Thatcher's influence, partly under the influence of wider ideas about conditionality and the need to avoid giving people something for nothing, and the desire to ensure that work incentives are supported by benefit sanctions through welfare to work schemes in the 1980s and 90s, and now through the work requirements in universal credit. And the Conservative Party's response to recent basic income proposals, for instance, from the Scottish government, which tried to win UK government support for basic income pilots a couple of years ago, the Conservative government's response has been extremely hostile. Conservatives have dismissed basic income pilots as a kind of SNP vanity project in Scotland, and have pushed back very strongly against the idea that basic income is a sensible way of developing the UK tax and benefit system. So even though individual Conservatives, some Conservative councillors, maybe the odd Conservative candidate, can be found sympathising with basic income proposals, the party as a whole seems to have come a long way, or rather to have gone a long way away from its earlier sympathy towards the idea. Now that, of course, brings us on to Christopher, who has been involved in the Conservative Party on and off for more than 50 years, and whose own political memories go back right into the 1940s, I believe. I very much enjoyed reading Christopher's book, Learning from Difference. It's a fascinating memoir in which the personal and the political are interwoven, and which gives a really rich sense of how Christopher's own life experiences have shaped his thinking about social security and about work, and indeed what makes a rich and fulfilling life more generally. So Christopher, perhaps you might like to sort of kick us off by telling us a bit about how your own experiences have shaped your interest in basic income.
Well, I mean, one begins by the fact that I had a basic income from the age of 11. My mother died, and my father went off to India, and I was abandoned with various aunts and people. But I did have this small income. And so this made me aware that whilst life was extremely difficult, because I was sent to a public school I didn't like, and then shipped off every single holidays to a different aunt, I wasn't actually going to starve. But the trouble was, where you had to live, I couldn't at the age of 12 rent what I'd like to have done, to rent my own room. But no, you had to go off to all these different people. And so, I mean, this set me up to realize that how, was unfortunately in many ways, in other ways, I did have this more or less financial security. And it was this sort of realization that sort of made me realize just how terribly difficult it was for other people.
You were involved in Conservative Party politics from the early 1960s onwards?
1960s, yes, yeah.
Yes. Were there many people within the party then that you were aware of who were interested in basic income type ideas?
Well, I think you sort of may not realize this, but the war was still hanging over us so much. I mean, almost all the MPs I sort of had contact with, all the MPs I had contact with, James Pryor, Ian Gilmore, David Howell, Keith Joseph, Willie Whitelaw, Tony Barber, there's the ones I sort of recall, they had all fought. Many of them had been in a tank or in a machine gun or something with their colleagues literally dying in front of them. Willie Whitelaw tells particular stories about how he got out of one tank because it hadn't got the right equipment. The other person got in and was dead a minute later. And this made them feel very strongly that if anything after the war, we must try and make life more equal. Conservatism made sense because it was about individual initiative and not having too much state provision. State provision had actually somewhat destroyed my father's business because what they were doing was nationalized. And so there was the fact that business literally went because the airlines were nationalized. I was against that. And so one was drawn to these conservatives because they were very nice, charming people. And they wanted to do something, simple as that.
And you clearly believed that that you were called to a life of service, and that having a basic income in the sense that you did was something that enabled you to serve the community in a variety of ways. What did that mean in practice?
Well, service was sort of throughout the family. I mean, my grandfather Juliet was First World War, and this was actually pushed into one by the grandparents, who were the only ones alive, that you didn't think of yourself. If you'd had a privileged education, your absolute duty was to make society better for other people. Now, this may be regarded as paternalism, and that in some ways one was interfering, but it came over very, very strong. And I was wondering what to do after one had to national service and then university. And I realized there was something called the Youth Employment Service. And this one trained for, and one got something called diploma in vocational guidance. And one was responsible for trying to make sure that every school leaver was settled and happy in their work. We each had to fill in this form, which nobody comes on, and you can see that form just, and it has in it something called a review of progress. And it was our duty to keep in touch with every young person until they were happily settled. Those were the words that were sort of put through. I mean, it's almost farcical today when you think they're trying to do that in the gangs in East London or somewhere. But that was our task. And we scribbled on here every time we'd seen them and checked that they were all right. Could we do anything? Could we help them in some way? And week by week, those who were unemployed came to us to receive the benefit. No question of going to the Department of Employment. We were the people who provided what I can't remember what it was now, but we provided the weekly allowance to these people. And the argument of people who were discussing all this was that it's terribly important that benefit is continually paid by an education service, because they will then look after these people and help them in other ways. And the actual handing over the benefit is a chance to keep in touch with them. So thus we progressed, and I mean, to cut a very long story short, because we'll talk about after, eventually, as some of you know, this service was privatized, which I think was a very great pity, but you probably want to come in now and ask on what I've talked about so far.
So you were involved in the Youth Employment Service in the Midlands, I believe, is that right?
First in the Midlands, and then I became principal of part of London.
Yeah, and you involved in careers work with young people in schools and training colleges.
Yeah, I mean, I never forgotten going to a comprehensive in the North Midlands, and there were people there who literally couldn't read and write. And I came up, and the master said to me, the teacher said to me, "Now, don't worry, Mr. Balfour will organize everything for you. He'll get you nice jobs." I hadn't a chance. I mean, they literally couldn't read or write. 50 in a class of a comprehensive in north of Birmingham. I've always remembered that. And sort of seeing all these people afterwards and sort of trying to see, is there any way we can get into a technical college, or can we get an extra teaching, extra help? It's just left this sort of profound memory that for heaven's sake, can't we not do more? We've won that wretched war. Isn't the absolute need to somehow pour more and more resources into education to give more people a start? I mean, a lot of these people somehow made out, but then you come on to benefit and all the rest of it. But I mean, they've somehow made out, these people. But I just felt so strongly, having had the privileged query of a public school, that the thing was hopelessly weighted. I mean, at Eton, we just got everything. These people got nothing.
This kind of experience cannot help shaping one's politics, one's attitude to the world.
And whilst the Conservative Party was as it was, there were a lot of other people who felt the same. It's another long story, but I was asked in the middle of this to stand as a Conservative candidate. And I, as you know from that book, I sort of tried to present a picture of profit was okay, provided that you actually used it to try and deal with some of the inequalities. And we got on fine. And then, to my horror, the chairman of the local Conservative Association got into business troubles, and the association was taken over by a rabid right-wing crowd who absolutely were determined to get me out. And as I was quite busy enough doing the career service as well, I said, "Okay, you get what you want." And they got hold of Sally Oppenheim, who was just exactly the person they want, for someone who may remember, I don't know. Anyway, but I'm veering off to what keep you on the right road.
But it's interesting that you were almost at the very forefront of having to deal with the Conservative Party's move to the right from the mid-1960s onwards. I mean, we hear a lot about how local Labour parties were taken over by left-wing activists in that period, but we hear much less about how that was also happening on the ground within the Conservative Party, even under Ted Heath's leadership. Yeah.
I mean, I met Ted Heath once or twice when I was in a very junior, but I just thought he was a genuine, compassionate man who his own origins were fairly sort of down the pole, as it were. And he having got there and having served in the war and seen all that, he desperately wanted to make a good left-wing, compassionate Conservative Party. And the whole story of what happened to him is so sad, because I think if you read all their biographies, it was connected with ill health. And if he hadn't had an illness they didn't discover till after he resigned, he might have actually survived. And it's how these little things just make an enormous difference to everything.
By the time you weren't quite successful in 1966, you performed very creditably as a Conservative candidate in Gloucester, but you didn't win the seat. When you did hold elective office in the Forest of Dean, from 1979 to 1987, you were an independent councillor. Was that a reflection of your sort of growing distance from the Conservative Party?
I was so sad by what happened to Heath. I can't remember, when did Thatcher come in?
75.
I mean, Thatcher, to me, okay, she knew what she was doing. politics of the corner shop and all the rest of it. One admires what she achieved, but it was just so foreign. And if you read, for instance, I don't know how many you read, but one of my favorite books you may have heard of is Ian Gilmore. Have you come across Ian Gilmore? Have you read Ian Gilmore? Have you?
I tell my students to read that.
You do, and his other books.
Oh,
I mean, this shows. James Pryor was the other really quite big paddy, because we were actually having discussions. I put proposals as to how the Youth Employment Career Service could be improved, and he had accepted them. And we might have got somewhere. Then he was dispatched to Northern Ireland by Mrs. Thatcher because she didn't want that sort of left-wing person about. I mean, she actually wanted to remove some of these people. Ian Gilmore came out, David Howell came out. Keith Joseph was desperately committed to do something along the lines of so, it was all the discussion about what was it called, family income supplements, FIS, and all that went on in the Green Paper. And Keith Joseph was very much a leader of this. And again, you just don't know what would have happened if he had won that election. An awful lot of people advised him not to go. There was fuss about which date in February to go. A lot of people, if you read his books now, will say that had he gone a few weeks earlier, he might have won. And then the whole question was then whether the tax officials and all those people would be starting to say, look, these ideas are fine, but they could ruin the country. We just can't afford them at the moment. So you didn't have the chance to explore whether they would in fact have been possible. But had Heath continued, who knows what might have happened.
I know, I mean, part of the challenge, of course, is that the economy went downhill very rapidly in 1974 and 1975. And it's interesting, even looking in the papers, that some of the civil servants say, you know, the tax credit scheme had been produced in that moment of optimism when the Treasury thought money was no object. And by the mid and late 1970s, the deficit had risen, and there was so much concern about the financial markets and the deal with the IMF and so on. It was much harder to find the money for radical schemes like that.
So it will always remain an unknown. What might have happened.
But it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I find particularly interesting in your book is the discussion of the bridge project. That you ran in the Forest of Dean, and I suppose the way in which you have moved between thinking about kind of high policy, you know, big ideas that governments might carry out, but also you know, small scale practical schemes that will make a difference in people's lives. Could you tell us a bit about the bridge project?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm not quite sure what the dates were, but it became, for various reasons, difficult to go on in the Youth Employment Service because we wanted to be somewhere else. And by that time, investments had worked quite well. So I managed to build up my sort of private income enough. And I was aware of the coming unemployment problems. It got to, I think, 22% in Cinderford. So I said to, I mean, it's all very odd because we had this tiny house in West Gloucestershire whilst we were in London. We let it, and we had, when we were in the Midlands, we had this. So that was our base, even though I worked in both the Midlands and London. And I said to the local people, look, this dear brigadier who is standing as the local council person, I'm not sure if he's quite the right person. And so several of them said, well, why don't you stand yourself? I said, well, they've adopted the brigadier, so I'll stand as an independent. And I just walked round and round all the villages and said to everybody, look, I'm standing. If I'm successful, I will try and listen to your demands or requirements. And so we went down to the count, and I'd seen this large pile of votes and assumed that they were the brigadiers. And someone said to me, look, Christopher, do you realize they're your votes? And so I first found myself, to my great surprise, as a councillor in the Forest of Dean. And then came the massive unemployment I talked about, and all these schemes that the Conservatives, it was the Conservatives, but then they were bringing forward. And it occurred to me that with unemployment so high and with a not very effective careers office in the forest, if I talked to all the councillors of all parties and said, look, is there not a need for the council to try and set up somewhere where these people can go and learn some trades and generally be helped at this stage of life? By chance, I then met the local vicar, and he said, look, the diocese wants to get rid of a school, but we're prepared to wait. And so we were allowed to take over this school and set up these opportunity programs and were employing, I can't remember the numbers now, but I think we started with about 20. And then the first idea was that we would have a centre which people could stay at until they got settled. And then the Manpower Service Commission changed and said, no, we will only finance people. I forget, was it 1 year or 2 years? It was a much short stage. So you had to change everybody once a year. But at that stage, we got up to 50 or 60 people.
One of the challenges you faced was the way in which the supplementary benefit system in particular, dealt with the earnings that people might get from working on projects like that. Yeah.
The disregard, I'm sure you're aware of the wretched word disregard. Is it still used?
I think the word is still there.
It's what you were allowed to disregard. And at the beginning, if we gave them more than sort of £4 pocket money per week, £4 per week, then they would lose their benefit. Yeah. Now, okay, lose your benefit and then go on to it again. No, not so, because once you've lost your benefit, it might take 8-10 weeks to get back on. And this was absolutely critical because most of the households in that part of the forest were very, very poor. And the benefit money, losing even that little, made a great difference. And their parents were saying, well, you can't possibly go to the bridge project, even if you like it, because if you do, you'll lose the benefit. So I sort of put on my councillor hat and went down to the syndicate office, and the first reaction, well, we can't possibly change rules, we can't possibly do anything like that. An interesting thing in life for people who might be thinking that way, if you are a councillor, if you are elected in any way, anybody within the state organisation will answer. And I've other periods of my life will no one will answer anything. But if you
sorry, Christopher, Christopher, that last bit came out. It didn't quite. Yeah, it got chopped up. So you were saying if you are a councillor, just remember that, and then it kind of chopped up. So
just remember that people will answer your letters. Who got that?
Yeah, got it.
Yeah. So people in the state will answer everything. And so I went on sort of barraging, and eventually they said, they sent a missive down to the syndicate office saying, look, these people can receive more than £4 a week. So it was 22% unemployment. It didn't help much, but it did help a bit. And we had people who sort of early retirement who were acting sort of supervisors, and all sorts of people all came together, and it actually was a very sort of happy and I thought worthwhile endeavor.
What I find so striking there is the parallels between, the experience of the benefit system at a time of mass unemployment in the 1930s, which drew Juliet Rhys-Williams into thinking about basic income, and the same kind of problems which you and others faced in the 1980s.
Yeah, and there was a lot of discussion, and that's when one began to learn about basic income. And people wrote, there were some people in Maidstone, I remember particularly, who set up an organization. They wrote articles which explained why we need a basic income is to get over exactly this problem which you've had at the bridge, and which will allow people to do voluntary work, to go into care homes, do their own thing. It sort of opened up a sort of panorama of other possibilities for so many people.
And I think one of the challenges which basic income campaigners have had is that it's been very tempting for governments to try to deal with kind of the technical issues in the tax and benefit system, changing the disregards, changing the way in which the tapers operate if people's incomes go up, and so on. In a way that tries to deal with the problems which basic income is trying to deal with, but often in a fairly narrow way, and often by creating new sets of problems, and without opening up the kind of opportunities that you talk about, that you've enjoyed and that people would enjoy with a basic income to decide how to live their lives and how to combine work or paid work and self-employment, care, education, and so on.
But I mean, for instance, here now in Winchester, there are 90 people on the waiting list for allotments.
90?
Yeah, 90. In the Forest of Dean, there was quite a lot of spare land. Traditionally, the miners could run one pig in their sort of, a lot of them had sort of houses buried in the forest, and they worked in the mines for part of the year, and then they survived in the forest with their one pig. So there were these different variations on life, which so much more sort of encouraging to the human being. And I just felt people have said, well, want to work on the land, but there is so much sort of land that isn't being used. Can it be that some people could be encouraged to grow their own things, as around here in the allotments? People, it's an absolute sort of lifeblood for their lives and the things they do. And this is only one example. I gather that Jeremy Corbyn much enjoys his allotment. This kind of different sort of life is so different to sitting in front of these computers and being stuck in this. It's just trying to open up life's possibilities as I've seen them.
Yeah, sorry, Peter, I just wanted to ask, just following on from that, I mean, about one thing that I actually remember with some fondness was the enterprise allowance scheme back in the 80s. And it certainly helped a lot of working class people I knew to set up their own businesses, and they went into things like photography. One set up as a political cartoonist, and most of them became quite successful in the end.
Yeah.
And I heard at one meeting one time that only took about 5 people to run.
Yep.
So basically, the idea was that you would get your welfare, but then you would get £1,000 on top of that.
Yep.
And then at the end of the year, if you'd managed to set up your business to a certain degree, then you came off welfare and did that. So
it's very much the same thing.
Of that, or
yes, and I mean, haven't some people talked about having a basic income, about a participation income, that it's acceptable if people can say to the authorities, I want the extra income in order to do this, which is extending the idea of the enterprise allowance. And there are so many ways of looking at it, not just the pure basic income idea, but it's trying to, again and again, to help people live more fruitful and enjoyable lives.
Right.
Yeah. You are someone who has, followed these debates now for a long time, and been interested in basic income specifically for almost 40 years.
Yeah.
What would you say, in the political situation we're now in, what do you think would be the most promising way of trying to move the basic income discussion forward
Well,
in the coming years?
I start off, I'm afraid, by washing out the Conservative Party. Now, I do this because I try to understand a lot of the people in the Conservative Party are not ex-war veterans. They are people who have struggled very hard to build up their business or to do something. A lot of them had a pretty rough time, but they've done it. And so this is where the something for nothing comes so strongly. I've done it. Why should someone else? It's this different atmosphere to what I knew in the 60s in the Conservative Party, which thinks that I really don't think you're going to get that way. I therefore come back more and more to what's going on now with the idea of progressive alliance and the hope that things like Mark Drakeford and what different councillors are doing in Brighton and things may be the way to go. But I do think one's got to be absolutely honest about the difficulties. And if you go to the House of Commons and the recent debates they have, and it underlines the arguments against. And one of them is that if you tried to do the same basic income for everybody, you would still have to help some groups of people even more. Yeah. And at conferences or discussions I've been to, this has been put again and again. Also that so much work has gone into universal credit that they're trying to improve it all the time, and that unscrambling it is going to be an enormous job. And unfortunately, you've got this sort of sanctioning idea rather than just helping idea. And this was in fact what my bosses at the beginning of the Youth Employment Service said. It all follows round. We desperately don't want the Youth Employment Service to go from education to employment, because the attitude to people they're trying to help is all the time helpful in the education service, but in the employment service, it is how can we get the figures so that we get the maximum number of people in work, which is runs through the organization. A lot of the individuals are very well-meaning; they try very hard, but it is a different attitude, and so that is the difficulty one's up against.
So the prospects in the Conservative Party now appear to be pretty slim.
I mean, I may be wrong, but I mean, whenever I go sort of near them, we know people there, and we have them, and I know, I understand what motivates them, and I respect it.
Yeah. So if the prospects in that respect are not terribly promising, what do you think the most constructive thing would be for basic income campaigners to do at the minute?
I think what they're doing is really all they can do, but they have got, in doing it, they've got to recognize some of the perceived problems. And there was a committee meeting, wasn't there, in the House of Commons about a year ago, in which a lot of men left people, I looked at it on the web, and they said all the reasons they wanted it. And then the Conservative convener or leader of that group, who was summing it all up, just rubbished everything. He wouldn't do, what was he called, peace, something like that. Was he, remember? He was an MP, and he just rubbished the whole thing. Yeah. And what one wants is to have a listening and an understanding. One worry about these petitions are that they're sent round to the European Union by enthusiasts, which is well done them. But I just feel that it is the people who are actually in local government. You know, we've got the wonderful example of Mark Drayford. We've got other groups of councillors. We know what's going on in Brighton. And it is these people who are hammering away, but realistically. And then if indeed get a coalition of all the other parties the next election, whether they would put it in their manifesto, I don't know. But I do think that individual politicians have then got to try and discuss and listen to people's reactions. And it's only by sort of one-to-one that some of the worries people will have will perhaps be overcome. And I think it's a very long task, but I'd like to think it's not impossible.
That's fascinating. And I mean, it's striking that I was struck last week that Keir Starmer has decided to make the future of work one of his sort of main focal points in the coming year. But of course, it's very hard to know what the future of work will look like.
Exactly.
Come out of this pandemic, because the economy is still so uncertain. I think
who wants to?
Sorry.
I mean, who wants to be sort of sitting in Amazon all the time doing all these things when they could be doing more constructive things?
Right.
And also, you've got to have. I mean, some employers are pretty brutal, and to be able to say to an employer, "Sorry, I'm just not going to play by the rules you're putting down."
Yeah, and then that power to say no.
Yeah.
The basic income would give people.
Yeah.
Would really transform many workers' relationships with their employers.
And in fact, would probably do the employers a lot of good.
Yeah. I mean, we have a productivity problem in this country.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Basic income may well be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, that was thank you. There are so many other things I want to sort. I mean, one thing I would like to point out, you know, that the Labour Party in Wales has seemed to have swung behind a pilot of basic income. And certainly the work that the Lab Network is doing, the UBI Lab Network is doing with people in different parts of the country, I think has been fantastic. But I don't know, they did actually get, with their recent pledge campaign, they got one Conservative councillor to sign it in Bolton, and he won the seat. So, and I think we do get the odd person coming to us either by social media or, well, usually by social media, basically. And they're usually young Conservative councillors who are very interested in the idea.
Yep.
And they can see the problems with universal credit. I think, you know, both the weight and the punishment. I mean, I thought it was very interesting what you said about, you know, things being transferred from education into the employment department, because it's definitely, you know, when I've had conversations with, say, the PCS, the Social Security Union, you know, workers union, I'm always trying to say that, look, you know, people could actually help people rather than spending so much time policing them.
Yeah.
And that's certainly something that's, you know, come out for me more recently. And I just, yeah, I mean, I think also though that just the fact that there is a big movement about basic income, I think is also kind of pushed the conversation farther forward. So say, for example, like when lockdown was happening last year, you know, if we hadn't been making a big fuss about emergency basic income, the self-employment scheme wouldn't have happened.
Yep.
All right, that happened right at the end of that week.
Yep.
After there'd been a big push, the government had to answer, I don't know, 4 or 5 questions in Parliament about basic income or emergency basic income. And I think that does show you, you know, like what can actually happen.
Yep.
And, you know, we still have furlough going until September. And I'm just wondering, you know, well, what will happen after that? And will jobs come back? Will people be, you know, to me, I think basic income is is necessary so that people can create businesses and do activities which actually look forward into the coming economy. You know, because
Can I
obviously
answer
some
that?
things will change. Yes, please.
I mean, I do think, reference to the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party at Westminster may be slightly more favourable than the constituency parties. It's the constituencies that are run by these sort of self-employed entrepreneurs, other people. And the problem is that as a conservative, I know so well, as a conservative candidate, you have got to not fall out with your association.
But isn't there a recognition by at least some people who've built up businesses that they didn't do it on their own? I mean, I've never met anybody who didn't have help either from their family or something. Okay,
I don't think
there's
they
a kind
want,
of myth about the self-made person, you know, a self-made.
yeah, but I don't think they want to admit it. I think having got
Sure.
there, you know,
Yeah.
why should someone else have help I didn't have? Is the sort of the mantra almost. I mean, I've talked to them. I mean, they're all nice people. They worked extremely hard, but,
Sure.
you know, something for nothing. Our something has got by our bloody hard work and taking risks. Why should someone have it for nothing? That's is what comes over and over again. There's a fact.
Right.
What they say.
Yeah. No, totally recognize that.
I think it's interesting too that basic income has almost moved out of a kind of narrow frame of sort of social security policy debate, or even economic policy debate, and people's responses to it reflect their wider cultural attitudes. Increasingly, I mean, I think one of the reasons why basic income seems to have attracted so much attention over the last few years is it resonates with people's desire for choice, for autonomy over their own lives, for support for creativity, and for their reaction against what they see as being the kind of punitive elements of the current welfare system. But we have a conservative leadership which is very adept at playing kind of culture war politics at the minute, and kind of tapping into people's suspicions of each other and people's sense of resentment at other groups in the community, and at the sense that that they are being exploited so that other people can have an easy life. And it's very easy to see how an argument against basic income fits with the kind of politics which the current conservative leadership is playing. I think we have to be aware of that.
And I think that has got to come into any discussions, the things that the people have, that awareness. I mean, I very much wonder, perhaps, do you know, I mean, is John McDonnell, who I had the privilege of meeting, is he still got it in mind, or is he out of the picture?
Pretty much out of the picture, actually,
Is
in
he?
some ways. Yeah, I mean, he's unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons we wanted to have this is just because politics has become so tribal. And you know, all the parties seem to have their factions, and you know, if you're on one side or the other, then you're the most evil person in the world, or the most wonderful person in the world, depending. I would just like to see people kind of come together just to try to solve problems, you know. And that's sort of how I came to it. I was a welfare advisor, and just, you know, and I just kind of hung on to the basic income activism as a kind of lifeline, because it was.
Will the Greens and some of the Liberals sort of get together and be sufficiently numerous to influence the rest of a partnership?
Yeah, well, you know, I think there's some hope. I mean, I think with, you know, I think that there's a big sea change with this, well, you know, with the Senate decision. I mean, well, it hasn't been, I don't know if it's been an announcement anyway. I don't know whether they've actually looked at it properly yet, but But yeah, I think there's a lot of hope in that. I think that, you know, might move some more in the Labour Party. We know that there are a lot of people in the Labour Party who support basic income, who can't actually speak about it because they happen to be in the shadow cabinet. So,
I mean, yeah, and I mean, even Jonathan Reynolds, who is the shadow DWP secretary, I think is a basic income supporter, but
yeah,
the direction that the party leadership is going in at the moment, for, well, politically for quite understandable reasons, but it's a shame for the basic income movement.
I'd like to open this out a little bit. We have Carolyn Richardson here, who has been working on a proposal called Basic Income Plus.
Yeah, I think one of the most distressing things is the tribalism over this. There seems to be a lack of adults in the room politically at the moment. I'm a disabled person, and my disability makes me chronically ill. So I have worked, and I worked so hard that it probably speeded up my descent into the benefit system and not working. I've looked for a long time at universal credit, and I've looked at the benefit systems in general for a considerable amount of time, and there didn't seem to be solutions that tick sufficient boxes. And universal credit isn't actually a bad idea. If you say everyone can get it, as long as they're poor enough to get it. And that's one of the issues, is you can only get it if you are absolutely so poor and don't have anything. So it strips people of their assets. So if you weren't poor before, you're going to be poor to get it. So you tumble from, in my case, a lifestyle of ponies and then later horses and very middle class, that you tumble downwards to become one of those people at the bottom who isn't deserving or is classed as undeserving. And part of that, I think, is, as it's been already suggested, it's a real issue. And I look at people and I think, my tax money educated your children, and you're now telling me I'm not good enough. So there's all that stigma involved in it. There's all that lack of opportunity, because to be on universal credit or any means tested benefit, you absolutely have to have hit rock bottom. And from there, you can't climb up. This is no springboard, but neither is it a platform. It's just all too low. And then overlay on that sanctions, demands, criteria, but across the whole benefit system, with the exception of, are you a child or a pensioner, which get a form of UBI, but everyone else has to be judged and questioned and tested and assessed. And this is what makes things like universal credit toxic. Giving people a benefit is not a toxic act. Sanctioning them, punishing them because their bus was late, that's a toxic act. Having a benefit set so low that it doesn't cover your needs is a pretty toxic act. So when I set out to create mine,
I should explain that Carolyn has put together a scheme for Basic Income Plus, all right, which is based on the JRF poverty rate. Is that right, Carolyn?
Yeah, it's based on a basket of goods that covers basic needs. It addresses UBI in a different way because it pays a household amount, because obviously household costs don't increase. Rent doesn't double because there's 2 people in the house, or treble because there's 3. Neither does the electric bill or the gas bill. So the needs of the household as a house are taken into account, and then the needs of the individual are priced.
Right. So
by pricing it in that way, you don't get the ludicrous extremes of 4 adults in a house all getting a amount that is very comfortable, and 1 adult in a flat struggling very hard. There's no leveling of that causes more problems.
Okay, that's interesting. Could I bring in Adrian Hilton?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Of course, what Carolyn's just explained isn't a universal benefit. It's something tailored then for each household, which ceases to be universal. I'm coming at this very much from the other wing of the party, from Christopher. I was struck by the phrase he used, that he wanted to see a left-wing, compassionate conservative party. I want to see a right-wing, compassionate conservative party. I was and am very much on Thatcher's wing of the party, having been an advisor to Michael Gove for a while, through the academies and free schools. In fact, that was my latest book. And I look at this and I want to see the nuts and bolts of how a UBI, universal benefit, can work. Because if it isn't universal, then we're tinkering around the edges again of something that is tailored to each person's need, which is where we are at the moment with universal credit and various other credits and various tax reliefs and so on. You either have a UBI or you stick with sort of what we've got and tweak it. If we are to have a universal basic income, and let me go with this for a while, please. It has to be piloted, as it's being done, as you've referred to, by Mark Drayford in Wales at some point. How, please explain to me, somebody, how a pilot of UBI can ever work. You only ever have the area where it's being piloted benefiting from the additional income, and that means somebody elsewhere. I mean, if say it's being piloted in Clwyd, the people of Cardiff, and indeed London, because England will of course subsidise this somehow, because England does subsidise Wales through various grants, as it does Scotland. If it's a transfer of wealth from Cardiff and elsewhere to Clwyd to make the UBI pilot work in Clwyd, it isn't accurate. It can't be accurate in its outcomes because the people of Clwyd aren't paying for their own UBI, if you see what I mean. So the result of that pilot can only ever be positive. They all get an extra income and they're all very happy because they aren't themselves in Clwyd paying for it. Have I explained that? It's a question that I very much like an answer to, please.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think it's a particularly good question for many of the schemes that we have seen labelled UBI pilots in different parts of the world, most of which are either financed by development money, for instance,
yes,
in India, South Africa, Namibia, and so on, or are basically tweaks to the benefit system funded out of general taxation and absorbed by the population as a whole. I think you probably could do a pilot on if you wanted to tweak the change the tax rates as well as the benefit rates, you would need a large enough jurisdiction that you could expect people to remain within that jurisdiction, even if the tax changes were unfavourable to them. You could maybe try it in Northern Ireland, but I haven't seen any suggestions that Northern Irish politicians are interested in this.
Well, there have been actually. No, there've been about 6 councils that have wanting to pilot UBI, and yeah, there's been quite a lot. And there's a move now to talk about a kind of reconciliation based income.
Okay,
Something like that, to try to bring, try to bring peace between the different communities there. So,
but to be honest, I'm in agreement with Adrian that in a sense a pilot is potentially a bit of a dead end.
yes.
Not least because, of course, it's bound to be time limited, and the fact that the basic income might only be there for a year or two makes it very difficult to know whether people are going to respond to it in the same way in terms of their attitude to work and their attitude to saving and education and so on.
Well,
that
yeah, but
they thought it was going to be there forever.
if everybody included is to be given, say, another £8,000 a year without their current benefits and so on being stopped, which of course is what UBI would set out to achieve, then the outcome of the pilot can only ever be positive. And that's a problem. It's a problem because it isn't a true pilot and it doesn't have the true effect that UBI would actually have in a nation. Now, if Scotland or Wales or England or Northern Ireland were all to do it as individual nations, then you begin to see something that's nearer to a system working. But I don't see how the pilot can ever truly reflect what would happen if a state adopted the policy.
I mean, I think, you know, you need to look at things like what's happened in Stockton, California, where they've done again, it was a kind of minimum income. All right. And you know, people were more in employment because they could afford to buy themselves clothes, get to actual interviews and that sort of thing, you know, whereas the system at the moment is basically punishing you if, you know, as Carolyn said, you know, if your bus is late or, you know, and you can't get to an appointment, you know, there've just been some really horrible stories, all right, about how people have been punished by this system. And so I guess I don't really see why. I understand your concerns about a pilot, and many I share, okay, particularly the time limitation, because you don't know what people will do. Like, you know, you can never sort of say scientifically, well, what are people going to do if they know the money's going to be forever, all right? Because you're doing a time limited pilot. But on the other hand, you can see how in the pilots where it's more like piloting less conditionality, if you see what I mean. And you can see that people actually do make better use of their resources. They're able to make better use of their time. They're able to set up businesses on, you know, for themselves and, you know, and explore and do training, you know, which will get them better jobs. So I do share some of your concerns about piloting or a limited pilot, but yeah, I would say that, you know, you can at least see what, you know, unconditional money, and Christopher talked about, you know, he had his own unconditional money, which he did he made amazing use of with his life, all right, and trying to promote British industry in various ways and trying to, you know, help people that were having trouble getting jobs. So, you know, and it's more that kind of vision that I can see with basic income. Now, whether this can be piloted or not, I would like to see more, you know, I would like to see more kind of pilots that aren't based on income so much, but actually throughout communities. Because I think I live in a very dense area of London, which is also, you know, some parts, you know, you have from block to block or from flat to flat where I live. Some people very rich, other people very poor. I think, yeah, it would be really useful in a situation like my estate. It'd be great to pilot it on my estate because we have such, you know, huge income disparities, and to see what people would actually do with the money. Christopher, do you want to come in?
I'm trying to think of something intelligent. I mean, I see entirely what Adrian is saying, and that's why I'm still saying all the time that too much enthusiasm may be counterproductive. Discussion has got to be really hard on the undoubted possible benefits, but the difficulties of getting there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd say one other thing.
Yeah.
I was looking up the last few days some of the correspondence of my first principal when I was a junior careers officer, and his letters, because we got to each other quite well, because then I was a principal too, and he used to make contact. And he would say, "Oh, Christopher, I'm afraid it's all going away from education. And I just remember this particularly now. It's going away, and he's long dead now. I just can't bear to think what will happen if the Department of Employment gets hold of all this. How right he was.
Oh yes, Caroline, sorry.
Yeah, I think we have to stop running away from this idea or trying to ignore the idea that DWP and HMRC must be involved in this. And for them to be involved, we need people to talk to them. They have to be happy to listen. And the government itself has to be behind this.
Right.
And this is why I find so many of the pilots to be a world of wishful thinking sometimes, that will just give people money. And I know Adrian pointed out that he thinks there's not a lot of difference between my system that I'm proposing and the universal credit system, and how, you know, how these are needs. Well, exactly, that's the whole point of it. We identify people's needs. But my system would be no more personalised than universal credit is. It would be exactly the same as universal credit and the other benefits are. And that's the idea of bolting on, which is what universal credit does.
Mm.
What we're taking away is the overlay of unnecessary administration and the restrictions, and the thing that actually stops people flowing through life because they're in a constant state of being stressed and losing benefits because taper rates are poor and being sanctioned and losing benefits that way. Instead, we want to put this level of stability in. And I make no apology if my basic income looks like universal credit. No apology at all whatsoever. But we need to do something about the huge level of instability, and also the actual level is set too low, and people will go, oh, well, gas horror, she's going to give them thousands. I literally am not. I am not a generous soul. I can live on £10 myself a week quite happily. I have, you know, don't have high expectations. And I think I'm being reasonable. I really genuinely think I'm being reasonable. I believe people, if they want a better lifestyle, can work. However, we have to accept there's a lot of people in society can't work, will never be able to work, and we really need to be cushioning the blows that the current welfare system seems to be raining down on certain sectors.
Right. Thanks, Carolyn.
Who is Maggie up there?
Oh, Maggie's also in Basic Income UK.
Did she come on?
We weren't sure if we were gonna,
She's not.
if there was going to be a lot of chat. Hi, Maggie.
I'd be very interested listening to the history of your career, Christopher. My grandfather was a Labour MP. You probably knew him, Patrick Gordon Walker.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, in a time where I think I was very interested in the sort of tribalism that was being discussed, and I think it has got worse and worse and worse. And I'm not saying once upon a time it was all sherry happy in politics, but I think there was possibly more respect and more listening to other ideas, and I think that's a great shame it's been moved away from.
Patrick Gordon Walker was a very much a campaigner, wasn't he? I remember him. I think he had a very good reputation. He was a very genuine person.
Yeah. I mean, he was pretty gung-ho against injustice in all forms.
Exactly. As indeed many of sort of the Attlee time socialist people were. But I'm just coming back to what's just been said. It does make one think that should all this effort that is going into basic income be going to desperately trying to improve universal credit.
I really feel that the basic income conversation has won some improvements.
Yeah, good.
Okay, so it's almost, because I was in the anti-cuts movement for years and years. All right, we won a couple battles, but we're obviously not winning the whole thing. And for me, it's as much about kind of shifting the conversation, you know, and if it does result in improvements to universal credit, that's fantastic. But there's a way that I feel like the left is like too involved in trying to shame people.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just so shameful that you do this or do that, and there's poor people and blah blah blah. And I think there have been studies shown that really only moves about 20 to 30% of the people who already agree with you.
Yeah.
And the people that you want to shame, well, they don't feel ashamed. Okay, so I mean, telling them not to be ashamed, or telling them to be, they should feel ashamed of themselves.
Yeah.
I don't know, like all the times that's happened this past year with Boris Johnson, I kind of don't see the point really. So yeah, I mean, I really, yeah. So for me, it's like, well, let's go a step further, and then see how far we get. Because certainly just campaigning, and I've certainly seen several campaigns to try to improve, even just like whether it's a 20-pound uplift or whether it's getting rid of the 5-week wait. So you campaign against the 6-week wait as it was, and you get the 5-week wait, okay? Or so for me it's as much about, well, let's improve the whole system, let's see what the best system can be. But if you sort of talking about something that sounds relatively shocking, like basic income, well, everybody gets some money and gets at base the same amount of money, and whether it's Carolyn's plan, which would also include housing and expenses, etc., or whether it's just really a flat rate basic income, has, I think, started to move the conversation forward. And I also think that what people are also realizing that maybe that, and as Caroline was talking about, that maybe it's not so much inequality which is the problem, but insecurity for people. And I think in a way it's like, as somebody who is from the left, I think the left has really kind of honed in on inequality, which again is divisive, all right, but not really talked about the real insecurity that people feel in their lives, whether that's because of, because of gig working, or because of 0-hour contracts, or because employment itself is, just generally not as secure as it used to be, or what people kind of think of as it being used to be. And then the other question is how much work, as you were talking about, doing care work or volunteer work, how much work is necessary. It's necessary work, as we saw, during the first lockdown with all the mutual aid groups that sprang up to help people in the neighborhood, because the councils just couldn't have coped. If they had to get all the different meals, and because I was involved with my local area, all the different things that people needed to them, it just wouldn't have happened, basically, unless, without our community involvement. So, I think those arguments are, for me, what are really important. Yeah. Hi, Adrian.
I would like to see genuinely more work on this from the right, in particular on the virtues of UBI over Friedman's idea of a negative income tax, which has enormous virtues to it. And it would be focused, and indeed on more along Caroline's lines of looking at families. If you're helping needy families with a negative income tax, you are doing more good than giving wealthy families a universal basic income. And I would like to see genuinely more work on the morality, the ethics of the virtues of UBI, if that's what this is projected towards, over Friedman's idea of a negative income tax. Because it seems to me at the moment that the negative income tax, from a conservative point of view, helps more than a UBI as an idea.
Well, it's still for us, it's like taking away the means testing is quite important. All right, because I certainly know that a lot of people, because of the shame that's been kind of poured on benefit claimants over the last sort of 10, 20 years, from both Labour Party and the Conservatives, all right? I'm not fingering the Conservatives about this at all. A lot of people get into massive debt before they actually claim what they were entitled to, say 6 months to 8 months, 8 months previous. And by getting into that debt, then it's usually to family and friends in the first instance. It's not to the credit cards necessarily. And those relationships get broken up that they actually need to survive, you know, when you actually end up, you know, having to claim in the end. So I think like trying to remove those barriers, like I think a negative income tax would definitely be an improvement.
Yeah, but you're making an argument there for tweaking, though it's a quite a major tweak of universal credit, which I would agree with. I think the wait of 5 weeks, and then I think it's a 9-month wait then before you get help with your mortgage.
Right.
It's absurd. It is
yeah,
frankly utterly absurd that you
absolutely.
have to wait almost a year to have some help with keeping a roof over your head. But those are improvements you can make to universal credit. They're not an argument for
Sure.
UBI.
But it's interesting. I don't think, like, would you be here if we hadn't been talking about basic income?
Would I be? Yes, I probably would, but because
Okay, it was just a discussion of tweaking the benefits.
I'm open to this very much so, and I'm not alone at all.
Sure.
In fact, I argue with people at Buckingham especially a lot about the concept. My instinct is toward a universal basic income, but I very much would like to see a conservative rationale for overcoming the arguments against it, ethically, morally, from a family point of view,
Right.
from an aversion to atomizing people into individualistic pockets, even within families. As Caroline mentioned earlier, if you give 4 people in a family a basic income, and then one person in a flat has the same income, then there's some atomizing that goes on that isn't necessarily conducive to sustaining families.
Right.
Families like to share. Families support each other instinctively, which is why if there's one income earner in a family, then they share, they support. And
Right.
I fear for human nature's individualism, that you begin to potentially give a route to family, another little route to break down in families.
It's interesting. Sorry, Adrian, to cut you off there, but just, I mean, it's interesting because they're sort of seeing the opposite happen in Kenya. There's a pilot that's being run by Give Directly, where I just heard somebody speak from that a couple weeks ago, and she said it actually, like, having the basic income, like the couples were being torn apart through financial troubles, and when each had their own money, they tended to get back together, which I just think is interesting. Anyway, Adrian, thank you so much for your contribution, and thank you for joining us. And Carolyn, also, thank you for joining us, and Maggie. And a big thank you to Christopher and Peter. Thought that was fascinating, both your history, Peter, and Christopher, your memories of the different fights that have gone on. I think it's really important to remember that these things have a history, and you know that things aren't always as black and white as what's often portrayed in the press and on social media. You know, people kind of impugn other people's motivations and all kinds of nonsense, you know, on social media. So for me, it was like really refreshing to hear from both of you. And thank you for joining us, Adrian.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a real delight.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you. And remember Christopher's book, Learning from Difference, which is available on his website. And Peter's book, Transfer State. It's a little bit pricey. I suggest you get your library to buy it. Okay. It's really, there's really no other history like it for the UK, I have to say. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Please stay in touch. Adrian, sign up to our newsletter if you don't know it already. And we can put you in touch with Carolyn. She's quite interested in speaking with you if you're interested. So that's what I like to see at a webinar, is people getting together somehow. It's really difficult these days with everybody just on Zoom. So again, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed this, and hopefully we'll be doing more kind of cross cross divide type conversations, because I think it's really important right now.